Good morning. The first thing I'd like to do is thank the organizers for having me and for putting this on. I have to make two apologies to start with. One is that I'm a philosopher. There's not much I can do about it at this point. The other one is perhaps even more damning. We got instructions as speakers to focus on the mathematics, which for a moment gave me some real anxiety. And then I remembered that I still had scotch in front of me. But no, in all seriousness, I'm not going to focus on the mathematics in this talk for reasons that I think will be, there will be some math, for reasons that I think will become obvious. So it's not willful defiance. I had to make a choice between giving you a overall picture where the math would fit in and then just focusing on a minute case. And I realized, I think again it'll be clear, if I were to focus on that case, it wouldn't make any sense as to why it was meaningful in this context. So as the kids like to say these days, if you want the math, this book that came out in 2018 is sick with math. So there's plenty of it in there. These two top publications, the Entropy, and then this thing that's coming out on quanta and qualia, has a lot of the math as well. In those papers, we treat specific cases, Wigner's friend, a delayed choice with a conscious observer making the decision, and entanglement and so on. So, and for the more philosophical stuff, I'm going to talk about neutral monism. These would be the ones, these slides, anyone can have my slides that wants them if you're interested. So I think the best way to get started is for me to contrast what I'm doing with what some other people you've seen doing in here and elsewhere. So some more explored ways of relating physics to conscious experience. Again, this is not meant to be exhaustive. I'm just trying to give you a contrast case. So relating the quantum wave function, realistically conceived, to conscious experience, how conscious experience emerges, how emerges from quantum, how conscious experience acts upon quantum, etc. This is one I didn't see here, but I've seen before, modeling cognition using the formalism of non-relativistic quantum mechanics. Making a decision is like moving from superposition to wave function collapse, right? We've seen much more elaborate and more interesting ways of connecting formalism to consciousness, but you get the idea. The point, obviously, is I'm not going to do any of that. Explanation and formal accounts relating qualia to the brain, formally in some way. In this case, explanation is typically dynamical, causal, information theoretic. These explanations you've seen are typically local. They're inside the head. Relating qualia directly to physics, such as the wave function. Again, typically dynamical, typically local. Okay, so when you look at these sorts of accounts, again, you've seen that in these last few sessions, the metaphysics that surround these sorts of projects, it needn't be, but it tends to be in terms of strong or radical emergence, panpsychism, or maybe dual aspect theories. Now, I don't buy, as some of my questions may have made clear, I don't buy any of that. I find all of these views problematic. Obviously, there's no time for me to go into that now. That would be a talk in itself. But I'll just say it like this. In my view, these are just patches on physicalism or materialism, which is wrong-headed to begin with. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So let me just be very clear, though. I'm very glad that we are trying to make consciousness studies more science-y. And if you knew me, as a philosopher, I'm well known for writing papers like from, scholasticism to science. So nobody has been more obnoxious about saying this is what we should be doing. And let me also make it clear that nothing I'm saying is contrary to IIT or predictive coding or global workspace as such. That is, if you buy what I'm going to say, that's going to change the explanatory scope of those projects and the way that you think about them. But in general, of course, I think there's going to be interesting and important formal relationships between consciousness and the brain. Again, with my philosopher hat on, I've written a lot about neural mechanisms, where I talk about networks, systems neuroscience, graph theoretical stuff. So I'm on board with all that, right? It's going to be about something bigger than that, which will be clear, I hope. And usually those sort of metaphysical accounts that I just mentioned, right? Why do those end up being the accounts? Well, we've already seen it. So I put Adrian Kent here. I don't know if he's here, but I put his name here because I thought he said it beautifully yesterday. I meant to write it down verbatim. I don't know how your senility is affecting you, but for me, it's getting stuff into long-term memory. This is not always working. So this is a paraphrase. So, why are you engaged in this project, these sorts of projects we've seen? Well, assuming we're not merely using mathematics to model some phenomena, and as I've already said, why not? Why would anyone object to modeling things formally in general, right? Then consciousness is a problem in fundamental physics, or if physics is fundamental, as he said, it leaves us with a glaring explanatory gap, leaving us with the question, how do we represent, model, or explain conscious experience formally, starting with physics as the base? So, and that seems absolutely right. If you take all this on board, then it seems to me you are indefinitely going to end up with something like radical or strong emergence, or something like panpsychism, with all the attendant and well-known problems that those have. And again, I don't have time to play that game now. I don't want to take all that on board. I want to reject that as a foundational base. And I want to do a different project. And the project is, how does conscious experience relate to relativity and quantum mechanics most fundamentally or universally? Where do we see those relationships formally? So let me give you an example of the sort of thing I want to do. And again, I can't, given my time constraints, I can't go into details about every case I'm going to bring up. Hopefully, many of you know about this stuff, but maybe you've heard recently about Lucy and Hardy and others have proposed tests of quantum mechanics where the setup is elaborate, and I can't go into it, but where we're going to use something like EEG, a la Lebesgue type experiments to see if we can get somebody's conscious choices to violate the statistics of quantum mechanics, or to violate EPR correlations or what have you. So you see what I mean about big connections between physics and conscious experience. And this is what, about those sorts of ideas, this is what Nicholas, I don't know how to pronounce his name because I'm the American idiot, Nicholas Gysin, all right, I really effed that up. So yeah, it's hard to be an American these days, increasingly harder. So let me thank you then for Boris Johnson, because you've given me a little bit of cover now. It's not all us. So this is what he said, and it gets at what I'm trying to convey. But if someone does the experiment and gets a surprising result, the reward is enormous. It would be the first time we as scientists can put our hands on this mind-body problem, or the problem of consciousness. Obviously, what he has in mind here is, if we could show that conscious decisions could violate the statistics of quantum mechanics, that would be profound, and it would suggest a radically different pictures about how consciousness and physics hangs together. So forget about EEG, right? The reason we do that is because of time problems, right? But timing problems. But you can just imagine a thought experiment. Think about a quantum delayed choice eraser type experiment. People like Wheeler, lots of people have imagined this, where it was a person that was making the decision, right? We all know how these things are set up. Some data is banked before, right? And then, the person in this case would get a choice about, depending on the setup, where, the state of the slits, or where to put the lens or whatever, right? And you can imagine, you're gonna get in the system and you're gonna be like, I'm gonna try to violate the statistics of quantum mechanics. Why not, right? I'm the one who gets to decide where the lens goes. Shouldn't you be able to do that? And obviously, again, if I had time, I would actually show you what that meant, but you get the idea. So here's the point. Most of us would bet that a person's conscious choice couldn't violate the statistics of quantum mechanics, including me. And if that's true, the rules of quantum mechanics here are dictating experience, even for people at space-like separation. That's pretty strange. And although many of you might be inclined to think about this dynamically, in terms of faster than light non-local causal connections or something like that, I'm inclined to think this is highly suggestive of what I would call AGC, an adynamical global constraint. That sounds spooky, but there's a lot of it in physics. So let's back off quantum for a second, and let's go to relativity, where it's very obvious. And let's look historically at some of the things that Einstein said. I'm not going to be able to read all this because of the time, but The point of these passages, very famously from Physics and Reality in 1936, is it ramping up to doing special relativity. Einstein is very clear that physics is already about experience. In fact, and this is not just the relatively trivial claim that physics starts with experience. No one's going to deny that, right? It's that it's actually all about relating, making consistent experience. It's about one's experience, whether it's in an EPR setup or delayed choice setup or Wigner's friend or whatever. Experience is not an afterthought. Again, I can't read it all. So this is how I would put it. I'll come back to the quantum case in more detail in a second. Relativity and even quantum mechanics, the quantum part is the one you'll be questioning, result from the fact that no one's sense experiences, such as measurement results, can evidence a favored perspective on the quote-unquote real external world. This is known as the no preferred reference frame. So in relativity, this is straightforward. You think about the relativity principle and you think about the light postulate, right? Think about those for a second. Think about what a huge difference those make to enable the sorts of experiences that we have. If those things weren't true, I think it's safe to say there would be no experience, at least in the Kantian sense of what we mean by experience, or it would be weird as hell, right? I wouldn't even know how to think about it. Well, what we did in the entropy paper, which again, I'm not going to get to show you the math of, is basically we showed that this is now about entanglement, right? We're all used to thinking about relativity in terms of these adynamical global constraints. But when we get to, and there's lots of other stuff like this in physics, right? Conservation laws. And those of us who take Lagrangian explanations seriously is not merely a mathematical trick, which I know is the standard view, not for me. I actually think that stuff is often more fundamental to the dynamical story. That's kind of part of the point here. But we're all familiar with these non-dynamical, adynamical type explanations. It's very clear in relativity. Einstein calls them principal theories, right, as opposed to constructive theories. Philosophers of science talk about this stuff all the time. But in quantum, as you've seen in these sessions, we're much more inclined to think dynamically, the Schrodinger equation or whatever. Of course, that's only when we're doing non-relativistic quantum mechanics. If we go to relativistic quantum mechanics and we think about Lagrangian formulations, again, which many people just think is a trick, I don't think it's just a trick. I think it's actually a deep fact about reality, taking future boundary conditions seriously. Then we can also think in terms of give non-dynamical explanations in quantum mechanics as well, and I think we do. So again, I can't go through all the stuff, but here's basically the analogy. Okay, so empirical fact, Alice and Bob both measure C as the same, regardless of their relative motion. Empirical fact, this is about the Pearson bound. So the question here is, we're interested in quantum mechanics. Why aren't quantum correlations stronger, right? What constrains them? Why isn't it even weirder than it already is? Huge question. That's a question that, for example, QIT people pursue very vociferously, and I think everyone should be pursuing it. I think it's an important question. And to make a long story short, so there's the analog of that, right? Alice and Bob both get that, regardless of their relative Stern-Gerlach magnet orientation. Alice says of Bob, and Bob says of Alice, time dilation and length contraction. Just stop right there, right? In order to reconcile Newton and Maxwell, Einstein realized everyone's got to equally think about the other people, the other frames of reference, time dilation and length contraction. That's about experience, right? That's what we actually experience, and we get this from physics. Likewise, on the quantum side, what we argued in this paper and showed, I think, is that in order to explain why that bound, why quantum correlations aren't stronger than they are, then you can explain that adynamically if you're willing to just say that on average, right, this stuff is conserved. Not in a case-by-case basis via some hidden mechanism or some dynamical story, but over space-time on average. Again, that's the entropy paper. It's all there. I obviously can't give it to you now. So on the relativity side, the no preferred reference frame is about the relativity of simultaneity. On the quantum side, it's about average-only conservation. Now you can, of course, these aren't entailments. This is just a way of looking at this. So On the on the relativity side, you could bring in ether, a preferred frame, and we all know that there are interpretations of quantum mechanics. I'm not saying they're ether theorists, but they try to tell us they need a preferred frame, like Bohmian mechanics. And obviously that's not just about making it Lorentz invariant, right? That's about making it make causal sense in space-time. And then over on the quantum side, you could bring in hidden variables or some dynamical mechanism or whatever, but you don't have to. So can you make mine? That's cool. I mean, if it means time's not going, then we're all good. All right, I'm going to keep going doing that. So I'm quoting, I'm going to quote some physicists here. And the primary reason to quote these people is, hopefully you're like, well, if they think it, it must be true. So this is Wilczek. He's a Nobel Prize winner again. I mean, have you ever heard of a Nobel Prize winner being wrong about anything? So this is what he says, right, to give you a flavor of what we're after. A recurring theme in natural philosophy is the tension between the God's eye view of reality, comprehended as a whole, and the anti-view of human consciousness, which senses a succession of events in time. So we all know the story. The punchline is, to me, ascending from the anti view to the God's eye view, and by that he doesn't mean Jesus, he means block universe, Lagrangians, 4D, right, is the most profound challenge for fundamental physics in the next 100 years. So here's also another person, right, who says, look, it's not all about dynamical explanation. Let's take this other stuff and think about it. So here's another appeal, blatant appeal to authority. Andre Linde has this idea: the universe and the observer exist as a pair. I cannot imagine a consistent theory of the universe that ignores consciousness. And then he says, according to standard materialistic doctrine, consciousness, like space-time before the invention of general relativity, plays a secondary role, subservient role, being considered just a function of matter and a tool for the description of the truly existing material world. But let us remember that our knowledge of the world begins not with matter, but with perceptions, right? And then he posits here, right, the idea that is it not possible that consciousness, like space and time, space-time, has its own intrinsic degrees of freedom, and that neglecting these will lead to a description of the universe that is fundamentally incomplete? What if our perceptions are real, or maybe in a certain sense are even more real than material objects? What if my red, my blue, my pain are really existing objects, not merely reflections of the really existing material world? Now, in all fairness, right, Andre is not a philosopher of mind or a metaphysician, thank God. So he may not know exactly what he's saying. The problem is it's multiply ambiguous. It could be sense data theory. What does he mean? Well, thank God for William James, right? Because here's somebody who does know what Andre means and said it way before him. And here I'm talking about neutral monism or radical empiricism, if you prefer. And here's the idea. Conceive of conscious experience in terms of a neutral monism. When you do that, you don't need strong emergence or panpsychism. I'll make it clear why briefly. And this deflates the hard problem and the generation problem. It doesn't solve them, it deflates the very premises that lead to the problem. So in this case, as I've been saying all along, physics is already about the business of directly explaining conscious experience. Neutral monism, again, I can't go into this at length. Here's the bottom line. Mental and material features are not separable or merely correlated. They are non-dual. Indeed, they are not essentially different and distinct aspects, right? Really take that on board. It's hard for us to wrap our head around this idea. Most people find it gibberish because it violates our experience, right? And this is not a dual aspect theory. It's not two distinct, essentially different aspects of one something. It's this stuff really isn't different. It's us that projects a difference. So as he says, a given undivided portion of experience taken in one context of associative plays the part of the knower or state of mind or consciousness, while in a different context, the same undivided bed of experience plays the part of a thing known, of an objective content. In a word, in one group it figures as a thought, in another group as a thing. I have a lot of this, I obviously can't do it all. Let's show you a picture. Pure presence is my lingo for the neutral. You could think about that as the contentless experience, right? We can talk about that. But yes, I would agree. In my view, it's nowness. It's that experience of now, right? Not being present as in relativity, but the ever-pervasive nowness. That's how I think about it. And yeah, I think if you trip or meditate or whatever, you can get in places where that's all there is, right? No self, no world. All right, so is that weird enough? Yeah. So this is the idea, right? So on this view then, the claim that the world is carved at the joints, all a physical versus mental, outer, subjective object is not a datum, but rather an inductive projection. It is, right? The generation problem, how is consciousness generated? The hard problem is a cognitive illusion. And it's this cognitive illusion that sets us off on the path of doing certain projects. We don't, if James is right, Russell and others, we don't need, so these projects are not doing what they think they're doing. So experience isn't inherently or essentially mental, and the external world isn't inherently non-mental. All right, I'm going to eat up a little bit of my discussion time. So I'm not going to go through all these quotes, but they're infinite. Pure experience in itself is no more inner than outer. It becomes inner by belonging to an inner. It becomes outer by belonging to an outer. So every American at this point wishes that he had a British accent because they can get away with just like reading stuff, you know, where it's normal. If an American does this, you're like already bored and it's like, why is he reading this crap? So I'm sorry my voice is not more mellifluous or whatever the right word is. So you get the idea. I think Evan Thompson, some of you may know, a body cognition guy, really nails this. Take a moment of visual awareness, such as seeing the blue sky on a crisp fall day. The ego consciousness makes the visual awareness feel as if it's my awareness, and it makes the blue sky seem the separate and independent object of my awareness. In this way, the ego consciousness projects a subject-object structure onto awareness. So he's talking about a school of Buddhism here. You can find it in Hinduism as well. However, the blue sky isn't really a separate and independent object that's cognized by a separate and independent subject. Rather, there's one impression or manifestation that has two sides or aspects, that outer seeming aspect of the blue sky and the inner seeming aspect of the visual awareness. You get the idea. Again, very hard for us to take on board, right? Unless you tripped a lot, as I keep pointing out. So if this is true, then physics is obviously psychology already, right? These various adynamical global constraints on the neutral, what James unfortunately calls the field of experience because it makes it sound like idealism or sense data. So that's why I'm substituting other terms. They're already just ways of partitioning the presence or whatever, the field of experience. So without, as I said before, without such constraints, all a Kant experience, Emmanuel, you guys say can't, right? Am I messing that up? It would either be non-existent or utterly foreign. Kant and others are right that we do not experience things in time and space, but whether we experience them temporally and spatially. But they are wrong to say that this is an imposition of individual minds and some categories upon some unknowable noumenal world. That's the point of radical empiricism. Get rid of the noumenal, get rid of the nonsense. This is it, right? What you're in right now, this is the shit. This is the deep stuff, right? And it's that break, that subject-to-object distinction. Right, so lots of people have had this similar idea. So, but the point is, subject and object and a world in space and time are both necessary and sufficient for one another. So, if this sounds like just nutty philosophy to you, you can find physicists saying similar things. If you want to really dig into it in quantum gravity, look at the literature on quasi-separability. To make a lot of those accounts like Wheeler-DeWitt work, you got to put in transtemporal objects by hand, right? To break the symmetries about the laws and so on. And if you didn't know what any of that means, I apologize. But here's what he says. Time may only exist and also self, right? By breaking the world into subsystems and looking at what ties them together. In this picture, physical time emerges by virtue of our thinking ourselves as separate from everything else. Obviously, the word self here is problematic. The language becomes problematic at this point, right? So again, a la Kant, such adynamical global constraints, including conservation laws, or if you like, divergence-free sources, help ensure that presence, again, my word for the neutral, is coherently carved up into a world of things with transtemporal identity. I'm going to finish, I swear. So at best, you might think, at best, such constraints are only necessary conditions for the possibility of conscious experience. So you might say, so what? But let's say that that's all that it is. I don't think it is a so what. Because what we've learned is, if you want it, the whole game here is to scientifically explain why we have the experiences that we do. Physics matters. These things matter. It's not just about what goes on in your head, your mind, or your brain, right? This is going to be part of the explanation. So again, you see me here rejecting brain centrism, and likewise with this picture, there's a lot of other things we're going to question. And furthermore, it may not just be necessary, because if neutral monism is true, these constraints are constraints on the neutral or experience itself. So, but even if I can't convince you of that, at least take this on board. Why can't we model features of conscious experience and cognition using least action principles, Lagrangian? Even in physics, explanation is not always dynamical, and we have a dynamical bias. And it also should be clear that how the foundations matter. What's, the bottom line of this talk is how you decide to play this game of formalizing things, how you decide to play this game of relating conscious experience to physics. It matters what your starting assumptions are a lot. So if you really think that consciousness is qualia, little tropes of seeing red, or discretized states, right? And you really think that the wave function is real, obviously I don't, and I don't think Hilbert space is real either, then you're going to get a very different story. And you're going to get some panpsychist story, an emergentist story, and then another story about how all these things are stitched together to get coherent global conscious experiences. Should be clear. I'm skeptical about all that, but the point here is not what I think. The point is starting assumptions matter. If the sort of view I'm saying is true, this is the last sentence I'm going to utter for now. If what I'm saying is true, then you're going to think about cognitive science differently. So you don't often see it in venues like this, but you have to know there's a whole other tradition, a tradition that's doing very well. Ecological psychology, embodied cognition, extended mind, and activism. And on those views, the self, even volition, consciousness is not, right? It's not just inside the head. It's extended in space-time, and for that matter, in culture and so on. And so, again, that bifurcation, that's our projection. And it might be great for pragmatic reasons, but we don't have to think about things this way. Likewise, representationalism is now questionable, right? If neutral monism is true, I'm not trapped in a virtual construct, again, of some noumenal world, all of which creates terrible problems. And representationalism has not, it's failed to explain many, many things. Thank you very much.